Hello everyone, we're very happy to have our last wonderful tutorial on the list of tutorials this year on the economics of social media, and it's organized by Guy Aridor from Northwestern, Rafael Jimenez Duran from Bocconi, Roy Levy from Tel Aviv University, and Lena Song from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We first have, I think, Lena give the first part of the tutorial, then we're gonna have a 15 minutes break, and then Guy will have the last part of the tutorial. So take it away, Lena. Thank you.
Great. Guy, do you still want to do an intro?
No, you can go ahead. That was good enough. So go ahead.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for the organizers for including our tutorial as part of the program. So just to give a quick outline, the two presentations we're going to be giving are based on two review articles. So I will first be talking about the economics of social media, which is published last year in the Journal of Economic Literature, outlining the empirical literature studying the economics of social media. And then Guy will be talking about how to use some experimental methods to study some of the questions that are covered in this literature review. And then I think as we were saying earlier, if you don't mind turning on your cameras during the talk, that would be really helpful. So I have some faces I can take a look at while I'm presenting. So it's not hard to motivate this topic to study, as social media platform is and really in the recent years have become an important part of the modern economy. Around the world, there are almost 5 billion social media users, and this represents about 60% of the population and 90% of all internet users. In the US, and this is a number that's surprisingly stable over time, that in the average American adult spend about 2.5 hours a day on social media. When we look at the younger populations, and sometimes when you look at these numbers, they're shocking, teens, based on self-reports that are collected in a survey, spend almost 5 hours a day on social media. And I have some work also collecting data, working with adolescents. Kids get phones as early as age 11 at the median, and they're already spending a huge amount of time on social media. In addition to that, when we think about how to conceptualize what social media is, it's a new technology that has both positive aspects and negative aspects. On the positive side, we can think about social media expanding access to information, facilitating discussions so that people may have discussions and debates with others that they usually may not encounter in their daily lives, and also help people to connect, so help people to keep in touch with their friends and family. At the same time, and this is sort of what's really common in the news and a lot of things that you hear on the media, that social media also poses challenges like misinformation, fake news, and false information, harmful content like hate speech, and also there has been a lot of debates around social media and mental health, especially among younger populations. So with all that background, also there has been a huge increase and existing ongoing policy debates and regulations in thinking about regulating social media. So you have these policies based in Europe, like Germany's Network Enforcement Act or Europe's 2022 DSA. And these policies think about regulating large platforms to discourage content that are potentially harmful to users, and then think about how to make social media platforms a better environment and work better for those who are using it. There's also recent policies in thinking about regulating social media use among younger populations. So it was a surprise. It was a little bit of a surprise to me that Australia actually pushed out this policy for minimum age for using social media, and kids under 16 are actually not able to sign up and actually use social media. And this is a very recent development in the policy space. All of that is to say, this is an important topic. And on the research side, we're also catching up, and maybe sometimes much slower in some field versus others. But there has been a surge in research on social media within economics. And here we're just plotting research since 2000s until 2022. This is a figure in our review paper. And there has been a huge surge in the past few years. And of course, since we looked at the data, there also has been a lot of recent work published in this area as well. So this is an area that a lot of researchers are interested in working on. So the goal of our review paper are threefolds. So we overall wanted to provide a guide on the economic literature on social media. And to do that, we start off by just defining what is social media, because when we have discussions, people might ask when you try to think about conceptualizing that, you can ask different types of platforms. Ask, is it social media? Is it not social media? Under what setting is it social media? So we talk about how to define or one potential conceptualization of social media, and think about what makes unique versus traditional media. And then in order to organize this literature, which very much is interdisciplinary and draws insights from many different fields, we introduce a framework in order to organize the literature into the 3 stages as you think about how content move across the platform. So we first start with a stage of thinking about content production, and then think about how that content produced gets distributed. And then the last step, think about the consumers who are interacting with that content, and then potential impacts of that consumption. And then within those 3 broad frameworks, we organize key insights and findings around those areas. And just a quick caveat, this review was published in 2024, and this is a fast evolving area. I will try to mention some recent papers that was not cited in the review, but that have been published, answering some of the open questions we posed in the review. But obviously, in the interest of time, I'll only be able to mention a couple. So this is not meant to be comprehensive, but just to give you a sense of what is the literature, or the state of the literature, and what are the interesting areas to look at. So in terms of what we're contributing to the literature, there is a lot of work thinking about using social media as data, because just to give an example, social media is a setting in which you can collect really rich network data. And a lot of people have thought about how to use social media as data. And then in our second part of this tutorial, we also think about, as part of the guy's talk, think about potential experimental variations that can be explored using features on social media or related to social media. This paper and my talk, this first part of this tutorial, is going to focus on social media as an object of study rather than a tool to study other questions. So I'll try to motivate that social media on itself is very interesting to study, and what are some of the economic forces that people have studied in the literature. And then also our review complements other reviews on related areas. And just to highlight a few, this includes the political effects of social media, thinking about issues of privacy, and also there has been a recent literature review looking at social media and finance. Our focus is going to be empirical papers in economics, and we're not claiming that we're comprehensive, but we'll try to at least highlight the key economic forces at play across the content life cycle, from production, distribution to consumption, which I mentioned earlier. So for this talk, just to organize the huge number of papers that are covered in this review, I'm going to try to describe for each of the stage what are the high-level incentives involved in thinking about how content is produced, distributed, and consumed, and then provide a snapshot of what have we learned so far. And then within each of those stages, I'll also highlight some open questions and suggest ideas for future research. So I understand this can be a very empirical heavy talk, but I hope some of the economic forces highlighted in the empirical literature are of interest, and encourage people to think about these questions further. So let me pause here, and if anyone has any questions on the outline so far. All right, let me move on then. I'll start by first defining what is social media. So when we started this, one of the tasks we knew we had to do is if we're going to write a literature review on social media, we better define what is the object that we're studying. And it actually took us a while to come up and eventually converge the definition we have today, given the nature of how social media is. It's both constantly evolving as the platforms are changing, updating their designs, and making changes that make social media today look very different in the early days of social media. In addition to that, even if the platform itself is the same, how users interact with the platform can also make the nature of the platform look very different. So it's also context dependent, depending on how users interact with the features of the platform. So to give you one example, in the US, I think when we think about WhatsApp, many of us will not say that's necessarily social media because we're just texting our friends. So we think about it as a communication app, similar to Messages or Messenger, in which we are communicating with our friends and not necessarily thinking about it in a social media setting. However, in other contexts like India or Brazil, WhatsApp is used often by politicians to target local groups. They will have huge WhatsApp groups in which people are posting content and potentially interacting with others that they may not already know. And to some extent, we can argue that WhatsApp may also be a form of social media in these other contexts. So then to solve this problem, we sort of came up with the solution of taking the word social media platform into the three individual words and trying to define around those words. So the social component is that when we think about social media, the content is mostly generated by users and involves interactions among users. So what makes social media is the social part of social media. On the media side, we think that it's similar to a traditional media market in which there are two-sided market with users on one side and advertiser on the other. And that's what makes social media more similar to traditional types of media. And then the last step is think about the role of the platform. And here we think about this last word as defining that something is a social media platform if it's an internet-based application that use some kind of algorithm to deliver content. We're not claiming here that the algorithm has to be sophisticated. The algorithm could literally be just delivering content in a chronological order in which they appear, but there is some algorithmic component in this in the platform itself that makes it potentially different from other settings. So then putting those three words together and then those features together, our definition of what is social media is that's a two-sided platform that primarily hosts user-generated content distributed via algorithms while allowing for interactions among users. So if we take an example like Netflix, which has potentially the media component and the platform component, we don't think it's a social media platform because it's missing the social component in which users are interacting a lot with other users. And you can also think about other examples like emails and other types of communication apps. And in that, we think it's missing some of the components related to media or platform. Of course, these lines are blurred, and this is one definition that allows to conceptualize what we're studying and also limit the scope of the types of papers that we're covering. But this is one potential definition of thinking about if we look at a platform or look at a particular product, what do we think it is? And then this is one way of conceptualizing what is social media. Any questions?
So just to clarify, by this definition, WhatsApp in India is not a social media, right?
Yeah.
Because
so
there's no advertiser.
Yeah, so this is where it's a little bit blurry because there are some advertising components in which you can send promoted content as well on WhatsApp. So in that way, we can think about WhatsApp being used very differently in India versus the US. I think the part you can potentially argue is maybe WhatsApp is less like a social media because of the lack of the platform part. But then there's also the aspect that maybe the algorithm itself is just one in which is showing all the content in chronological order. And in that sense, we'll say this is one of those borderline cases in which it's a little bit harder to define, but you can argue it going either direction.
Nice. And just I also saw a comment by Guy that's helpful, or good to know that WhatsApp also allows for ads. And same question about influencers. So they're kind of like they're both advertisers slash content creators in some sense, right? So I wonder, like, to what extent the two-sidedness is also the important part.
Yeah, influencer, that's a really interesting topic. There's a huge literature, for example, in marketing looking at influencers. And one of the, I should talk a little bit about who we think are the primary, like the actors within the social media platform within that life cycle. We did not have a lot of coverage on influencers per se, just given the scope of the paper that we were not able to cover in detail. But here we could think about influencers as a producer of content, and then the lines between whether they're producing content with a sponsored tag or not over there is a little bit blurry. Great. Guy, you want to add anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Oh no, I said in the chat, WhatsApp is now going to have ads in the near future. So.
Okay, great. So let me quickly talk about the framework we have. So as I mentioned, there's 3 different levels. There's the production, there's distribution, and then consumption. So on production, we think about, and this is sort of like one way to think about how this traditional media connect with social media. We can think about what are the actors in a traditional media setting. And then we have the media organizations, the potentially public figures like politicians, and then also advertisers who are pushing their content on the platform. And then finally, this user-generated content, and part of this with influencers can be a little blurry. We think about where do they fit, and especially when we think about micro-influencers. And here we have among those players that they're generating content that could be potentially displayed. And then our framework sort of goes down from the top and then moving down into distribution. And then when we think about distribution, there's different factors at play, including what is the existing social network and the connections that user have, the targeted advertising based on the auctions among advertisers. And then lastly, think about algorithmic curation in filtering and ranking the content to be shown to the consumers. So on the consumer side, we're going to talk about a few different aspects, and it obviously has implications for those who are consuming the content. So we'll talk a little bit about consumer welfare. Aggregating across other consumers and as well as non-consumers, social media also has societal implications, and we'll talk about that as well. And then putting together advertisers and how consumers spend their time on social media, that has direct implications for platforms. So the building block, and we're going to present a very conceptualized framework, very stylized framework, just to think through what are the incentives that each of the players at each of the stages have. What is the objective function they have? What are the constraints that they're facing? And then just to conceptualize that, we're going to have the building block across our framework to be a post. And let's think about this as a post of K characteristics. But of course, here it can be very abstract. So you can think about these as the post have a characteristic related to the sentiment they express, maybe related to whether they're an organic post or an ad, or how informative they are. You can put in anything sort of in this very abstract framework that we put together. And this is just thinking about that post as the building block that flows through this life cycle, and then thinking about for each of the stages, how do the agents interact with that building block? So let me first get to the production side of the life cycle. So this is the first part of our chart, and the main economic agent are producers. And think about them indexed by J. And these could be people who are traditional media organizations. It could be advertisers. It could be influencers. It could be just your friend or your grandmother. And all of those are think about these as potential content producers. In thinking about what is the problem they're solving, we think the producer J solves this expression here. And we think about X, we're indexing this by P for producer to distinguish between what is the content that producers produce versus the content that consumers end up consuming, because those things may be, the things that they consume is going to be a subset of those things that are being produced by producers. And the type and the quantity of the content that's produced depends on the beliefs that the producer have about what they will get out from producing a certain set or a certain type of content. We're going to talk about both monetary as well as non-monetary incentives for producers to produce content. And of course, associated with producing the content, that there's some cost, either monetary or the time through which the producer is making the content. So the set of research questions that we're going to answer are going to be around two broad categories, and this is how we structure it in the paper as well. The first set of research questions we're going to try to answer is, how do incentives affect the content that's produced? So what are the different types of incentives that producers face? And then how do they shape the quantity and the type of content that end up getting produced? And then on the second part of this, we think about producers. Some of them are producing informative content, some of them are producing fun content, but there's also content production of things that are potentially harmful. So think about misinformation or hate speech. And for those, we as a society may not want as much of those content being produced because those have negative impacts. So for that reason, we think about a second question, which is, how can the production of harmful content be deterred? And by looking at this stylized framework, there's two levers that we can move. We can either make it more costly to produce, so basically increase the C component, or we can potentially shift the expectation of the probability of distribution, this expectation component, this first part, to make it less valuable or less worth their time for the producer to produce that content. So we're going to talk about both of those things and conceptualize a lot of the interventions that people have thought about around those two components. So let me first talk about how to what are some incentives that do affect why people produce content. So when we think about the traditional media setting, we think that traditional media content are produced, for example, by journalists because they're producing it as part of their job, or they may have some altruistic motives for sharing information or sharing their opinion. So the first set of things I'm going to talk about are the non-monetary component of producing or share content. And here we're including both producing content as well as people sharing content with others, both as part of that production of content, just to make it a little bit easy to conceptualize. And in the literature, there has been several different incentives that have been outlined for why people might produce content, even if they're not paid. So when we talk about non-monetary incentives, these are things that they're doing regardless of some monetary compensation that they're receiving. And then we summarize those into 5 broad categories. One is that people like attention, and just the fact that other people are paying attention to them, then that gives them some positive utility, and that's why positive payoff, and that's why they're producing content. Another reason may be that people want to look good in front of others, and maybe part of that is why we tell others that we've donated to a charity, or we have our this is really dates me, but we update our Facebook profiles in with to be standing in solidarity with a particular cause. Part of that may be I want my peers to think I'm a certain type, the good type, and that's one of the reasons I produce content. And then another incentive is that people enjoy getting feedback and the words, and this may be likes, people giving a thumb up, and that's one reason that people might want to produce content. And then others may be producing content because they want to persuade others, and persuading them and getting somebody else to change their mind makes them give them some kind of positive payoff. Or others may just be posting because of some intrinsic altruistic motives, like including things like just keeping up with friends. So we find in that literature, and just to summarize what has been found, is that non-monetary incentives tend to moderately increase the quantity and frequency of content produced, and it has some effect on the quality of content, but it tends to be small. And interesting feature here, in case anyone's thinking about on the theory side, interestingly, the incentives may even propagate across producers, in the sense that if somebody receives incentive from some non-monetary incentives for producing content, they're also more likely to give non-monetary incentives to other producers. And of course, there's the monetary incentives as well when we think about influencers who get paid directly by the platform or by companies, and things like ad revenue sharing programs. Those have strong positive effects on quantity, but the literature shows that the effect on quality of content so far is mixed. So then when we think about the production of harmful content, we want to think about what can we shift on the cost side and expectation side. One solution of this is content moderation. So this can be either done by platforms or third parties. And oftentimes we hear about fact checkers, but you can also have just other users sanctioning users who are producing harmful content. So common interventions, this is a very rich literature, and I'm just going to highlight a few things that people have looked at. So on the misinformation side, people have looked at nudges, fact-checking, providing digital literacy to users, or creating a friction between when somebody's gonna looks at the content and when they're able to share. And the literature finds that nudging users to think about accuracy and providing some kind of digital literacy, and oftentimes the programs are evaluated so far just involve a quick reminder that what you see online, you might want to evaluate its veracity. Even these very light touch and short interventions, those seem to be most effective. And then we can also think about harmful content in terms of hate speech, and the interventions that have been explored in this space include counter speech, which is telling a person who's saying hate speech that what they're doing is not right. Content filtering, so filtering out content that are harmful, or not even letting them post the content, and also ex post content moderations like banning users who are posting harmful content. So literature finds that the counter speech and content filtering can reduce hate speech, but again, effect sizes here are small, while ex post moderation, of course, limits the harmful content at the present, but they have limited deterrence effect for future content. So some open questions in this space. And I'm just going to outline a couple here in relation to things I've talked about. So we talked about non-monetary incentives, but there definitely can be more work thinking about how monetary and non-monetary incentives interact and whether monetary incentives crowd out non-monetary incentives. There's also, we talk about influencers, and there's direct implications when we think about contracts that influencers might have, and this has implications for labor market dynamics that are interesting. And I've seen job market papers sort of studying that topic that are relatively new and interesting. And then we also can think about what is the implication of moderation policies when they're not just implemented for specific content and very labor-intensive manner. Now it's possible to significantly scale up moderation with either design of the platform, like Twitter's or X's community nodes, or things like using AI to identify and potentially moderate harmful content. Then we want to think about what is the implication of those policies when it's implemented on a bigger level, and whether that has any general equilibrium effects for people who are producing content. And then on the advertising side, it's and I work a little bit on this as well when we think about people posting harmful content related to content that are sponsored. And we want to think about what is the impact of these harmful content on how users interact with advertisers, and whether advertisers are concerned that their content may be associated with other users posting potentially harmful speech. So that's our first part, which is focusing on production. So before I go into the next part, any questions so far? All right. So let me move into distribution. So the first part we talked about for production, the main economic agents are these producers indexed by J. And then when we think about the distribution component of this, we think about the main economic agent being the platform, and thinking about how do they distribute the content from the set of posts that are being produced. So from the platform's perspective, and this is how we're conceptualizing this, basically like the platform is maximizing revenue, where they're choosing for each user what is the personalized set of content from the total pool of posts that can be shown to the user. So this revenue is when we sum it up across all users, for each user, it's made of two components. So one is how much time that the user is spending on the platform, and here we have the parameter TI to represent that. And then we're multiplying TI by how much we gain from each unit of users' time, and that gives us the revenue from each user. And then when we think about a lot of things that we're talking about here are based on the model that had been mostly adopted by platforms so far, which is this advertising-based model. Then we can think about this this monetary gain component, this alpha, basically as the ad load, the percentage of content that is focused on sponsored content, multiplied by the average ad price. So this is one way to sort of proxy what do platforms care about. And once we write down a problem like this, we see that they care about how much time the user spent on the platform. So they care about maximizing, in some sense, engagement. And you can think about this depending on the platform. They might be either maximizing on the short-term user engagement, or they're taking a longer-term approach. You can think about maximizing the long-term engagement by the user over time. So the research questions we're going to try to pose here, I'm going to try to walk through each of these questions in turn. The first one is thinking about how do platforms choose which content to show users. So they have to choose this XI from the set of XPs, and they get to make that choice given the data they collect on the user and as well as other users on the platform, as well as off-platform data. And then the second type of questions that we will try to answer is, does the algorithm work? So I have the word work here in quotes, because I will first talk about just whether the algorithm increase and maximize this term here. Does it actually maximize the time that the user spent on the platform? But also I'm going to talk about whether it works in the sense that, is it also delivering content that would be socially optimal? So I'll get into more details when we think about whether the algorithm is working well enough. And then when we talk about organic content, the other side of this is thinking about sponsored content. And I'll also talk about whether ads work in terms of affecting user behavior, and then discuss privacy concerns as part of that research question.
So can I ask a question? About the objective, the amount of time that user eye spend definitely depends on what you're showing them, but there is also this interaction component, right? So as you mentioned, like the social means that like I am interacting with other people, and maybe that's also something that would
Absolutely.
impact how much. I was just
Absolutely.
wondering, like, is it
Exactly. So actually, when I talk about the consumer's problem, we'll see that the consumer's problem in which they're solving T, that is going to be a function. Is your this idea that there's going to be spillovers, it's a very important part of that, and that's going to be modeled. You can think about this TI as what the optimal choice by the consumers, which is in fact potentially a function of other users. Yes.
Right, thank you.
So the first set of questions, just think about how do platforms choose how to show content. I'm going to first talk about organic content, and there's broadly two set of things that the algorithm is based on. The first part of this, and this is especially relevant in early stage of social media, which is platforms are showing content to other users just based on what is the content that has been produced by other users within their network. So this is like, think about early days of Facebook. You're just seeing the updates from your friends on Facebook. And there has been literature showing that in these networks, there is the characteristic that there is users connect with similar others, and terming this as homophily. And this is one component in which platforms choose what content to show. And then as platforms, I mentioned earlier, platforms is constantly evolving, and especially in the more recent platforms, the component of the social network becomes less important, and the part where algorithms just thinking about maximizing engagement, given all the potential content that's available, users may now see content from accounts that they are not even following, and then in platforms like TikTok, they're just seeing content that's being recommended by the algorithm. So here, platform needs to use signals to potentially predict what's going to make people spend time on the post, whether it was going to make people click or share with others. And then at the same time, they may also want to balance considerations of quality of content. And that could potentially, because downranking low quality content like clickbait may actually increase long-term engagement. So if the platform is just thinking about short-term engagement, then maybe they should show all the content that are divisive, that are clickbaity, but then at some point, users may no longer want to engage on the platform. So then the platform may actually, when we think about whether maximizing, they may actually want to think about maximizing the long run time spent. And over there, we'll see that algorithms they may show characteristics in which it looks like they're not just optimizing for these short-term engagement. And then on the sponsor content side, ads are based on auctions among advertisers, and we'll talk about whether they work once I get to the sponsor content part. So for the second research question of just whether algorithms work, if we're asking the question whether algorithm is increasing engagement, I think the literature so far has provided a lot of empirical evidence that algorithms do in fact increase engagement and time spent. And once you vary something about the algorithm or try alternative algorithms, we see that user engagement and time spent goes down. So, to say that, basically saying that we see that the platform is doing a maximization problem here, and it looks like they're doing a decent job in solving that problem. And this is relevant because what the algorithm serves the user often determines what users consume. So if we think that people are consuming content very actively rather than passively, then we think the algorithm may not play as a big role because people can just choose to read the content that they are most interested in, and they would have read regardless of what the platform is showing them. But a lot of recent literature has shown that consumption tend to be passive. So the algorithm is going to have important implications for what people consume and potential downstream outcomes. So for that reason, there has been a lot of concerns about the quality of the content that's being served as part of the engagement maximizing algorithm, thinking about low quality of content or like minded content. And the literature shows that algorithms tend to have modest effects on segregation in the exposure in terms of content that people see on the news. And interestingly, it both increases uncivil content, but also decrease misinformation. And this was one of the papers based on the Facebook 2020 papers, and they found that the algorithm could actually have opposite effects depending on the outcome that we're looking at. Other concerns people have had on algorithms, whether there is a rabbit hole in which recommendation systems are driving people into more extreme positions. The literature actually finds there is very little evidence of that. And then in terms of another potential concern is that the algorithm is biased and recommending content that are biased against certain demographic groups. And the evidence here, again, is mixed and depends on both the platform and even within the same platform. This paper shows that depending on whether you're looking at the news feed versus what the algorithm is recommending in terms of friends, there's algorithm bias in one, but not the other. So now when we come to the sponsor content side, so ads can be effective, and literature shows that there's actually substantial heterogeneity. On the more positive side, people have used ads to promote social causes, and there's papers showing that those can be effective. Interesting on the political side, and we know that a lot of money are spent on political advertising, the effect of political ads are negligible. And this has been shown in recent literature looking at large data sets, including political ads in the US presidential election setting. The concern that one may have is that for ads to work, it often relies on data from users and to be able to target users so that we can reach those that are most likely to move from the advertising. So that presents a trade-off for the platform between potentially getting higher revenue, because now we can have ads that are effective, against concerns about consumer privacy. And in terms of consumer privacy, there's interesting evidence showing that consumers actually, at least for now, are uncertain about how much they value their privacy. And there's also privacy paradox where how much they state how they value privacy look very different from the review preference approach in terms of how they care about policy. And here, work including Guy's work showing that platform profits could be influenced negatively with policies around consumer privacy, because restrictions to data access has shown to have negative impacts on advertisers. So then over here we have this potential trade-off for platforms of higher revenue versus protecting consumer privacy. And then some open questions include, how would alternative models like subscription-based models, how could that affect welfare? And then, or even thinking about alternative ways of ranking content. So for example, in New York, there is a policy that's recently implemented, it been passed and implemented in the near future, and thinking about moving away from engagement maximizing algorithms for children and adolescents. Then we want to think about what is the alternative algorithm that we want to implement in that case, and then also think about how does that look in practice and what are the impacts of those. We also
Lena?
have questions about newer platforms.
Lena, sorry.
Yes.
There's a question on the chat.
Yes.
With sponsored from Sayed. Would sponsored posts from influencers be considered as ads too in the literature?
With sponsored content from,
Influencers.
yeah, that's a good
Considered.
question. I would say yes, but Guy, let me know if you disagree there.
I would disagree there. So I think
Okay.
in literature traditionally thinks of sponsored content in this context as being kind of the ads that are served on the platform, so the things that are kind of auctioned off. Sponsored content typically goes through a different flow, right? Where it's not kind of through an auction on the platform, but kind of, external. And so all the results on kind of the efficacy of ads and their impacts are all around kind of sponsored posts that are explicitly kind of elicited from the platform and not the influencers.
Great. And that's a great question. And thanks, Guy. And then it makes like the conceptualization of thinking about who influencers are, that becomes really interesting. And they're sort of their content production is motivated by these monetary incentives, and while the distribution is like organic content. In terms of newer platforms, there's since we published our review, there has been recent work looking at how do newer platforms distribute content, and this paper we're citing here is a recent job market paper looking at a platform like TikTok in India, because TikTok is banned in India, that looks at how does this video-based platform distribute content, and what are its implications for toxic content. We also think about the welfare implications of privacy for the different agents that we've outlined in our framework, and the trade-offs I've discussed on the previous slide. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the last part of the life cycle, which is thinking about consumption. So the main agent here are consumers. I'm going to index them by I. They're solving this problem, which we're basically conceptualizing it as a time allocation problem. So they're solving a problem that depends on they're choosing between how much time they're spent on social media, TI, as well as other potential other activities, given the other content that is being shown on the platform. And you can imagine we can put this into this utility function, ti of t minus I and all the other users. And then we're saying we're trying to keep this utility function in as general as possible. So what enters into this expected utility? I'm going to highlight a few features that's been shown in the literature that's in some sense non-standard. So when I talk about the role of consumption spillovers, which is the effect that how much I consume on social media depend on how my friends or other users consume on social media, aspects of time inconsistency and habit formation, and then talk about how have people measured welfare in this context in which users are not necessarily paying directly for consumption of the content. And then when we think about aggregating individual users across the entire economy, then there's potential societal implications, and this could be through people's beliefs or through the offline activities that people may engage in. To highlight the economic forces, I'm going to talk about some of the channels that people have found on social media having aggregate impacts, and then provide some case studies for some of the evidence that have been found on the aggregate impacts that social media have. And then on the last part, I'll quickly talk about how do consumers substitute across platforms, because so far everything I've been talking about, it's within the platform. And then we also want to think about consumption across platforms. It's very common for most consumers to consume and use multiple platforms. So what enters into expected utility? The first characteristic is that there's positive network effects, that the more other people consume, the more I'm likely to consume. The other characteristics that have been found, and this is based on both Guy's work as well as my work, that this idea of habit formation, where how much I value consumption today depends on how much consumption I've had in the past. In addition to that, there is this feature that preferences can be inconsistent, where today at the beginning or yesterday, I said I want to only use TikTok for 30 minutes. But when today comes, I use more than 30 minutes and I would like to extend my limit and use a lot more than that. So how much I would like to use from the long run self versus the short run self are potentially different. So putting that together, I have this paper in looking at how addicted we are to social media. And we show that social media is both habit forming and also involves self-control problems. And those are two forces that have been found in literature that's features of addictive goods, both in terms of substance, addictive goods in terms of substance, but also behavioral addictive goods like gambling. And then that's not to say that social media is bad for everyone. It's not to say that we're all addicted to social media. We've also find within our sample that there is substantial heterogeneity across users. And then just yesterday, there was this headline in New York Times talking about social media use and adolescent mental health. And they find that the correlation between how long people spend on social media and measures of mental health, including suicidal ideation, it's very weak. But if you're looking at the correlation between measures of how addicted they are to social media and these mental health measures, they find that children with highly addictive use of these electronic and digital technologies tend to have much higher rates of suicidal ideation and self-harm. And this just to highlight that there are features of social media that are potentially different from the standard good, and then there's important policy implications for how we think about regulation of social media. So now we looked at the utility function. The literature has also thought about how do we quantify the welfare implications for the consumer. And one way of doing this is called willingness to accept methods, in which people are asked how much do they have to be paid so that they stop using social media for 3 weeks or a month. And here, the literature have found that users need to be paid a significant amount to stop using social media. And interestingly, there's this paradox. At the same time, social media has been found to have adverse effects on subjective well-being and mental health. And a lot of these literature shows that social media use negatively impacts subjective well-being and mental health. So one way to potentially reconcile these differences has been a work by one of our co-authors on these papers, by thinking about that non-users could potentially derive negative utility from other people using social media. This idea of fear of missing out, that if other people are using social media and I'm not, I may actually get a negative payoff. And with this negative consumer welfare, then it's possible to have a positive willingness to accept, to stop using social media, while social media having a negative impact on mental health. So that it's possible that the welfare for impacts for users at the level in which they're using social media is negative. But once you have that subtracting their utility for not using social media, then that difference is what they may report as their willingness to accept to stop using social media. And that's why we might see that they're both not willing to stop using social media, as well as potentially seeing negative impacts on their well-being. The important point here is that this does not imply that social media always reduces consumer welfare. It just means that this level in which they're currently using social media may not be beneficial. But it doesn't mean that it has to be zero for it to be the optimal level. The optimal level may be somewhere in between those extreme points. And then once we aggregate across users, we can think about what is the societal implications. And when we were summarizing literature, there was just so much empirical work in thinking about what is the impact of social media use on outcomes. And looking at across all of those evidence, we found that there's 3 main channels through which social media could have these aggregate impacts. We summarize them as follows. So social media provides exposure to content that's persuasive, and they're changing people's mind, and that's why they might have important and large societal implications. In addition to that, social media facilitates coordination of actions. For example, make people easier to organize protest, and that's another way in which it could have implications for societal outcomes. And the final aspect of this is related to the social aspect of social media, that we can see how other people are behaving and posting things. And social media may be a setting in which it shifts people's perception of others. For example, shift their ideas about what norms are, and that may be one channel through which social media could have large implications. So just to quickly summarize this literature in one slide, that we find we're just focusing on a narrow part of this, which is looking at political impacts, specifically in democracies. We see that the literature finds social media does increase knowledge and facilitate protests in democracies. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, we see that social media do influence beliefs and behavior in a negative way, for example, by misinformation and hate speech. There's implications. There's also a paper by one of our co-authors, Rafael Jimenez, which just shows that social media policies in regulating and moderating platforms against toxic content has potential implications on how people engage on the platform, as well as offline violence. And then in terms of polarization and voting, the evidence here has been mixed. So there is some evidence showing that social media could reduce polarization because it provides, for example, cross-cutting content, that people are exposed to content they may not be exposed to otherwise. At the same time, there's also evidence showing that social media could increase polarization. So the evidence here so far has been mixed, and our conclusion here is that the effect depends on the offline environment, and whether the online environment is more or less polarized than offline environment. That's going to influence whether social media has affect increased polarization or decreased polarization. So there's interactions between what people see online and what they see offline. And then on the last part, we talked about across platforms because it's relevant for thinking about antitrust concerns. So when we think about regulating social media, one basic and important question is, what is the market for the good that we're looking at, and how do you define that market? And we find evidence in the literature that consumers substitute not only to social media apps, but also to other apps, such as communication apps, as well as non-digital activities. So it makes it potentially tricky to think about what are the set of substitutes for social media, and what is the boundary for defining the market related to a particular social media platform. So some open questions here, including impact for younger populations. What are some tools and regulations we can implement to make social media work better for users and potentially increase welfare? And are there these policies that are intended to remove hate speech? Do they have some potential unintended consequences, like silencing political dissidents? And also we want to think about whether some of the implications we've drawn in the consumption side of this life cycle, for example, habit formation, that users, how they used yesterday affects their utility for using a good today. Does that have implications for competition among platforms on the supply side? So this interaction between the different aspects of the life cycle, and whether that has important implications. So Guy will also get into in the end of his talk, just think about some other broader open questions that exist across the three life cycles. But here I hope I give you a quick sense of what is the relevant questions within each of those stages that are potentially interesting. So let me conclude. This is an exciting and a rapidly evolving area of research. And the empirical evidence comes from all kinds of methods, including observational, quasi-experimental, and experimental data. And then in order to think about how you run studies related to this, Guy will talk about that in the second part of the tutorial on designing and running experiments related to social media.